Welcome to this video, Mastering the Fundamentals Late Stage Tournament Strategy. In this video, we are going to be discussing how to play the late stages of a tournament when the average stack size starts to get shallower and shallower. We're also going to be discussing how to play the bubble and the final table when there are big payout implications that you need to fully understand. And then finally, we're going to go through some simulated tournament results so that you know how much you can actually potentially make from playing poker tournaments. I hope you learn a ton. I hope you enjoy it. And before we get to the video, do me a favor. Go down there, click the like and subscribe button. Thank you. We're going to be discussing 20 big blind post-flop strategy. Understand that when you do see the flop, at various stack depths, ranges will be different based on which hands are shoving before the flop, which you don't get to the flop with, right? That said, 15 big blind and 25 big blind play similarly enough, and I wanted to be able to make this section concise enough to where you get a lot of good, clean information that will help you crush the games. So we're going to be going through 20 big blind spots. On pokercoaching.com, we actually have a lot of shallower stacked and deeper stacked scenarios ran for you already, so make sure you check that out if you want to learn more. When you see the flop, one player will usually have the range advantage, and one player will usually have the nut advantage. The range advantage is the player whose overall range has more equity. This is usually going to be the preflop raiser, except for on boards that are specifically good for the preflop caller. As an example of that, say under the gun raises and the big blind calls and it comes 7-6-5. Under the gun does not have a whole lot of hands that connect with 7-6-5, whereas the big blind will. So that's one of the spots where the rangers are much more neutral. And then the nut advantage is the player who has the nut advantage is the player who has more nuts in their range. So on 7-6-5, the big blind is going to have far more super nuts in that scenario. Whereas on ace jack 3, when under the gun raises, under the gun has all of the effective nut hands, right? They have ace king, ace queen, ace jack, pocket jacks, etc. So those are two very, very important things you're going to want to keep in mind. Which player has the range advantage and which player has the nut advantage. And typically, the player who's disadvantaged does a whole lot of checking and folding. And the favored player usually does a whole lot of betting and raising. And when you get shallower and shallower stacked, this will result in some leads from the out of position player where they bet into the flop aggressor on boards that are highly favorable. Also, you're going to find that when the board is dynamic, meaning there is a straight draw or a flush draw available, but there is no straight available, a straight or better available. So, for example, jack 8-2. On jack 8-2, there is no straight. Therefore, this is a spot where bigger bets are usually going to be used. But on boards with a 3 straight, like jack 8-7, usually smaller bets are going to be used. On a 3 flush board or on a pair board, in those scenarios, usually small bets are going to be used when you do decide to bet. Always, 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 please, please, please consider who has the range and the nut advantage, because that's really, really, really going to heavily impact your strategy. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some spots where the initial raiser is favored. We're going to look at some spots where the preflop big blind caller is favored. We're going to look at some paired boards and a bunch of other spots. Let's get right to it. Let's discuss a 20 big blind post-flop scenario where the preflop raiser is favored. On the flop, the preflop raiser, when they're favored, is usually going to be making a ton of bets, sometimes with their entire range. And the preflop caller is usually going to be doing a whole lot of folding, especially when they are out of position, because it's more difficult to realize your equity from out of position compared to in position. Once the preflop better bets with everything or close to everything, and the opponent calls, what does that mean? Well, that means the preflop raiser has everything in their range, but the caller only has their decent hands, which makes their range a whole lot stronger once they get to the turn, right? So, given the preflop raiser has everything, and the opponent has only good hands, this forces, on the turn, the flop better to usually bet with only their best hands and their draws, with a very strong polarized range. And once they do bet with a very strong polarized range, well, now the flop caller does a lot of folding again, because against a good, strong polarized range, even like middle pair is not loving it. On the river, assuming you bet the turn, you're again going to bet very polarized on the river, and the turn caller does a lot of folding. So let's take a look at a flop where it comes ace, jack, 9. And in this situation, we are looking at low jack versus the big blind. So the low jack raises and the big blind calls. This is the big blind calling range, all these hands in green here. I'm going to explain to you how to use this program. This is PioSolver. In this situation, we see the pot might be tiny for you, but it says 55. This means 5.5 big blinds, okay? So there's a 2 big blind raise, big blind called. Also, there's an ante and a small blind in the pot. Stacks are 180. Put the decimal before the last digit. This is 18 big blind stacks remaining. We're playing 20 big blinds deep. We put in 2 preflop. We have 18 left. Fine. Over here, we see our various bet size options that we have allowed the solver to use. We have bet 180, which is 18 big blinds, which is all in. We have bet 3.3 big blinds, which is about 60% pot. We have bet 1.4 big blinds, which is about 25% pot. And then we have check. Okay. And these percentages say how often each play is used. In this scenario, it is on the small blind first. So given it's on the small blind, this is what they should do. They should check with everything. Why are they checking with everything? Because they are highly disadvantaged. Okay? There are ways to actually see exactly how highly disadvantaged in the program, but we're not going to get to it. All right. So what they're going to do is they're going to check with everything. Now we get to see what the low jack should do. This is the low jack preflop raising range. You see they're betting with everything. They're checking nothing. They're betting 1.4 big blinds 62% of the time. They're betting 3.3 big blinds 36% of the time. And then they're making these other plays basically never. And whenever you do run a solver on your own, which I explain at pokercoaching.com, you're going to want to make sure you give the solver lots of bet options so that you can roughly find which bet sizes are highly preferred. Because what a lot of people do wrong is they'll run the solver with 1 bet size option or 2 bet size options, but maybe a different bet size is ideal. Maybe minimum is ideal some portion of the time. Maybe all in is ideal some portion of the time, right? You need to run the solver with lots of options so you see which bets are actually used. Anyway, ace jack 9. If you think about this range, on ace jack 9, it has lots of aces. It has lots of jacks. It has overpairs, or pairs with, pocket pairs. This is a very, very strong range here, obviously. If we go back and we look at the opponent's range, they have some ace X, but their ace X is worse than under the guns ace X. And they also have a whole lot of garbage, right? They have a whole lot of garbage. So they have to check everything. And now you can go through and see, pick up bet size you want to use. I would typically just tell you for simplicity, betting small-ish is very good as you get shallower and shallower, although big bets are used sometimes. So let's say we do bet 1.4 big blinds. This now shows how the the big blind should respond. They should go all in never. They should raise to 7.2 big blinds, basically never. They should raise to 4.7 big blinds with 14% of their hands. They should call with 24 and fold everything else. 62% is a lot of folds. But remember, they are highly disadvantaged here. When they're highly disadvantaged, they just have to make a lot of folds. And notice even in this spot on ace jack 9, hands like jack 8 are folding, which seems kind of tight to me, but it is what you should do. Notice some 9s are folding. King 9, queen 9, 10 9. These hands are folding a lot of the time because they are so demolished against the early position raiser's strong range. Notice when we do raise, we do not raise all in, again, because we're not favored at all, and we're raising into a range that does contain a lot of effective nut hands. So we do raise with our best hands, and then some quote-unquote draws. What are draws in this scenario? Draws are going to be some queen 10s, some 10-8s for open-ended, 8-7 for a gut shot, 10-7 for a gut shot, queen 8 for a gut shot, right? These are raising sometimes. And then some junky pairs as bluffs too. But everything else folds. And so what this solver lets you do now is you can go through and see how you would play based on which play you make. I'm sure some of you are wondering, what happens if you raise small? What should the opponent do? This is now what the low jack should do. They should call a lot of the time. They should shove sometimes with hands that are almost always good but vulnerable. Let's see what happens if they do happen to go all in. If they do go all in, you call off with all of your pairs, pretty much, right? And you're open-ended straight draws. Nice and easy. Actually, don't call with all the pairs. You fold out your jacks at check raise, which is kind of neat to see. But if you did check raise the flop with an ace, you got to call it off because we're shallow stacked. All right. Let's say instead we call, which is going to be usually what we do. If we fold the hands over, let's say we call, and now you can put in any turn. Let's say the turn is kind of a blank, like a 4 of clubs. Okay? Small blind now checks everything because, again, they're still highly disadvantaged. And now, like I said, on basically every turn, the low jack, the initial raiser, is not going to bet everything on the flop. They're going to do some checking now. And they have to do some checking now because the big blind has some ace X, right? So because the big blind has some ace X, they don't get to bet with everything. And notice the hands that really like to check are going to be hands like under pairs and middle pairs and bottom pairs. So we see like queen 9, king 9, 10 9, queen jack. These hands are checking a large portion of the time. When we do bet, we're going to be somewhat polarized with good ace X and better and some bluffs. What are bluffs in this spot? Looks like some junky bluffs with like queen 8, king 8, king 7. These are aggressive. So we're finding some pretty bad bluffs here. King 10, king queen. Kind of cool to see. These are the hands that opt to bluff. Notice you don't necessarily want to bet the queen 10 every time, because if you bet queen 10 and get shoved, you have to fold, and that's a bummer. Under pairs are used as bluffs. It's kind of hard to find bluffs here, again, because our range is pretty good. So when we do bet, we're going to be betting like 5 big blinds into the 8.3 big blind pot. So, call it 2/3 pot. So say we do bet. What should the opponent do? Well, again, they should fold a lot. They should fold a lot because now all their gut shots are no good, right? A lot of their nines are in bad shape. And we see only some jacks with live kickers and some aces are continuing. Jacks with live kickers or jack with the best kickers are continuing. Lots and lots and lots of folds. Let's suppose they call. Now we can put in whatever river we want. Let's say the river is just a blank, like a 2. They have to check everything. Then we're betting just a good, strong, polarized range again. Hands that are almost always good, right? The ace X is almost always good. And then some bluffs. What are our bluffs on ace, jack, 9, 4, 2? Well, it looks like the solver uses pocket 8s and pocket 7s and pocket 6s and pocket 5s as bluffs here. 8, 7 when we have it, 10, 8 when we have it, queen 10 when we have it, queen 8 when we have it, right? Kind of cool to see those are the hands that are opting to be used. Notice king high usually is not going to be bluffing in a lot of spots. So say we do go all in. What does the opponent do? They call it off with their aces, they call it off with some jacks, and they fold everything else. Again, a whole lot of folding because the initial raiser's range that bets the flop and the turn and the river is very, very strong. Okay? I know that's a lot. That's a lot to go through. And we only went through like half of the ways the hand can go. So let's go back. Let's say we bet 14 on the flop, or bet 1.4 big blinds on the flop. Big blind calls. Let's say the turn is an interesting card like a jack of diamonds. Now, interestingly enough, the big blind gets to lead some portion of the time. Why do they get to lead on the jack? Well, they actually have a whole lot of jacks. Notice the initial raiser does not have a lot of these bad jacks, right? They raise in the low jack seat. So they actually don't have a whole lot of these jacks that the low jack, or that the big blind does. And that allows them to make leads some portion of the time with some jacks and then some junk. The junks is going to be junky straight draws for the most part. Well, straight draws in general. So we see a lot of gut shots going for the lead. Cool to see. Say they do bet. Almost no raises. So why would we basically never raise in this scenario after facing a lead? Well, when someone leads, they're announcing I either have the nuts or I have a junky draw. If you have a junky draw, I want you to stay in the pot for the most part. And if you have the nuts, I really don't want to play for all the money. So say we call. Say the river's a blank, 2 of hearts. Now notice lots and lots and lots of all ends, almost no checking. If you had more nuts in your range, you could potentially even jam everything. But notice all the jacks are shoving and some busted draws are shoving. So say we shove. Oops, I clicked the wrong button. Say we shove. You have to call it off somewhat logically, but a lot of folds, right? Say instead, though, I want to show you on this 2 of hearts. Say we check and then face an all in. Notice we fold basically every time, 81% of the time. This is something that comes up every once in a while in scenarios where your range is super duper strong to bet and you have a lot of good hands that really want to bet, but that kind of leaves some of your junk hanging out to dry, and we're only calling when we have some sporadic 9s, jacks, and ace X, which is kind of weird spot, but cool to see. This happens whenever you do lead the turn that's specifically very good for you. Say the turn's, again, really bad for you. Say the turn's a king of diamonds. Big blind has to check everything. And again, low jack's going to be betting very strong and polarized, right? So say they do go for the half pot. We see some raises, not a lot though. 2 pairs, some random jacks, some queen. Well, queen 10's the nuts now. So a pretty strong shoving range there. If we do face a shove, we have to call off with just our good hands, right? Again, notice 2 pair and better for the most part. So yeah, that is this spot. You're going to find that these spots all play kind of similarly where, well, actually, let's go back to the turn because I don't think we covered this spot. Say we bet small on the flop, we get called. Turn is whatever, 4 of clubs. We check. I'm sorry, big blind checks and now low jack checks behind. This is when it goes check, check on the turn. Flop bet, check, check on the turn. Now, let's put up a random blank. On the river, this is something that comes up a lot, where the out of position player, the big blind in this case, is going to bet large when they do bet. They are shoving 2x pot a lot of the time, 16 big blinds into 8.3. Now, why would they want to do this? Well, against the checking range that is very condensed, it's referred to. It's a lot of like not ace X, right? Something like a jack and worse. Against a lot of jack and worse, you can put a lot of pressure on that. And if your opponent's range is jack and worse, because they're playing GTO, notice our aces become good, strong, super duper value hands, right? We can rip it in with ace 8, just straight for value. King, queen as a bluff. King, jack for value, right? King 10 as a bluff. Queen 8 suited, 10 8 suited as bluffs. Cool spot, right? When we do check, we have a lot of medium strength hands, but we do have some nuts to protect it. It's always important to protect your checking range by including some hands you know you're just not folding. So if we check now, the opponent should bet very polarized. Looks like they're potting it, which is cool to see. We then put it in with our ace X, which again is a little bit loose. Most people don't do this. And I would not recommend this in a tournament. You don't want to just shove in the spot too thin because you will be against the ace sometimes, and you want to conserve your last 8 big blinds or whatever it is. But you do see we're calling it off still kind of wide. Most people do not call it off nearly often enough when considering the GTO strategy, because to be fair, most people don't bluff nearly often enough. Let's say we did get this check on the river, the 2 river. What should they be bluffing with? You have to ask, will my opponents actually be bluffing with all the logical bluffs? Will my opponent shove pocket queens and shove pocket kings? I don't know. Will they shove the queen 10 offsuit? I don't know, probably. What about jack 8? Weird jack 8 shove, right? What about the 10 8? I don't know. When I say shove, I'm sorry, I said the wrong word. Will they bet pot with these hands? If they're not going to be bluffing quite as often, you can now overfold, right? So if your opponents don't bluff as often, you should be folding a lot. But look, I realize this may be kind of a new thing for you to go through these PIO simulations, but this kind of thing is very important for you to realize what happens in specific scenarios. And essentially, you always want to ask at each decision point, who is favored? Who has more nuts? Who has the range advantage in general? And if you're favored, you usually put money in the pot. If you're not favored, you usually don't. Also, as your opponent's range gets stronger and stronger, you bet less often because you don't want to be betting into a decently strong range. So this is a spot where you're betting the flop every time as the pre-flop raiser. We're now going to look at spots where the pre-flop raiser is slightly favored and then a spot where they are not favored at all. And we're going to see the differences in these situations because they are usually pretty drastic. Now let's take a look at a spot where the pre-flop raiser is slightly favored. It's not going to be a board that completely nails their range, but it's still going to be a board that's pretty good for them. On the flop, the pre-flop raiser still does a decent amount of betting. This is when they're going to have a slight edge, right? But now, instead of folding a ton, like we saw on the ace-jack-9 board, the pre-flop caller is going to fold, let's call it a medium amount, less often. They're going to fold less often because they just have more equity. When you have more equity, you don't fold nearly as often. On the turn, once the pre-flop raiser bets the flop and gets called, they're basically always going to be betting the turn polarized. But assuming they don't bet everything on the flop to begin with, like in the previous scenario on ace-jack-9 where they bet everything, say now they bet 70% of hands, that means that the pre-flop and flop better no longer has a lot of the junk, right? So if they're missing a lot of the junk, that makes their range stronger. So they actually get to bet more frequently once they bet the flop and the turn. Then the flop caller is going to fold some against this strong polarized bet. On the river, the turn better usually bets very polarized with just the nuts or nothing, and the turn caller calls sometimes. Again, there are some formulas you can use to figure out roughly how often you should be calling in these spots, but I think that's beyond the scope of this video, and this video is already a wee bit long. All right, so let's look at 10-6-3. 10-6-3, we are not favored in the big blind, so we're going to check everything. And now we see the flop better bets, the pre-flop raiser bets, what is this? 82% of the time, so not every time. Which hands like to check? Well, you're going to find that as the board gets worse and worse for you, the medium strength hands, I call them marginal made hands, these types of hands are the ones that really prefer to check. And this is going to be usually starting with ace high and under pairs and middle pairs. Ace high, under pairs, and middle pairs are the ones that start checking first. So let's look at under pairs. So let's look at pocket 9s and 8s, right? 9s and 8s and 7s check some. Nines is always going to bet less often than sevens, even though they're basically the same hand, because nines is way less likely to get outdrawn than sevens, because the sevens has to worry about an 8 or a 9 coming, whereas the nines do not. Ace highs, some of the medium ace highs are checking. Ace 9 and ace 8. Low ace X are checking. Ace king, ace queen, ace jack are checking some. We have a little bit of king high checking, but that makes sense. This is a very, very common pattern that you will see, where middle pairs and ace highs do a lot of checking. Notice we don't actually have a whole lot of actual middle pair with the 6, right? So we don't get to show what you would do here, but I would not be shocked if some 6s check. Also notice your checking range always contains some nuts. Once you start checking back with a lot of medium strength hands, you also need to check back some super nuts. So we do see 10s and 6s checking back too. That said, let's presume we bet. And again, I see these sizes are roughly split, right? You see 49% is betting 1.4 big blinds, 32 is betting 3.3 big blinds. If you wanted to just use one small size here, I think it's going to be fine and easy enough to play. And to be fair, if you wanted to really study that specific spot, you could rerun the solver, but get rid of these other bet options, and it will tell you how often you should be betting in this spot with particularly the size. It's not going to be the perfect GTO strategy. And to be fair, this is not the perfect GTO strategy because I only gave it 4 bet sizes. But if you give it 100 bet sizes, you're going to see that it's going to skew towards these smaller sizes in general. So therefore, you don't even need to run it with the gigantic sizes because they're basically never used. But if you really wanted to simplify your strategy and you know you're just going to always bet 1.4, rerun it with 1.4 and only have 1 bet size. It's going to be far from perfect GTO, but it's going to be easy to implement. So anyway, let's say we bet small. Now, this board favors well, it doesn't favor anyone all that much. It just slightly favors the preflop raiser. So now we see a lot more check raising and a lot less folding. Remember, on the ace-jack-9 board, the big blind was folding like 60% of the time, which is a ton because they're highly disadvantaged. Here, though, big blind's folding only 36% of the time because they're not quite as disadvantaged. Also, they're doing a whole lot more raising, 30 or 21% of the time. Which hands like to raise? Well, top pairs like to raise for the most part. Typically raise your best top pairs and call your worst top pairs. Also, draws like to raise. So what are draws on 10-6-3? Draws on 10-6-3 are going to be draws that do not want to check raise and then fold to a shove. Because once you start to get shallow, you have to be very careful betting stuff like gut shots and open-ended straight draws. Because if you bet and get shoved, you actually have to fold, and that's a bummer. So notice, a lot of you probably think the logical draws here are going to be 9-8 and 9-7 and 8-7 and 5-4, right? But take a look. None of those bet very often at all. Even 5-4 doesn't bet very often at all. And that's because if you bet that and get shoved, it's a disaster. You have to fold out 20-ish% equity or whatever they have, right? And that's not good. You don't want to go around folding out equity. So here we're finding some interesting bluffs that a lot of people never bluff with. You really want to have an overcard with a backdoor draw. Overcard with backdoor straight draw or backdoor flush draw is prime. So we see stuff like king 7 suited, queen 7 suited, king 8 suited, queen 8 suited. These are hands that are usually opting to put in the raise, which is kind of cool. Notice king 5, king 4, queen 5, queen 4. These are going for the raise a large chunk of the time. Queen 9 suited, king 9 suited, right? King queen suited for overcards, backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. These are quite strong. They're quite strong hands. By the way, in the corner right down there, you can see how each suit plays. So we see queen 8 of clubs without the backdoor draw in the very, very bottom corner, way down there. It folds every time, whereas the diamond, spades, and hearts check raise some, right? Same thing here, right? The clubs folds every time. Right here, king for the overcard, backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. The clubs fold every time. The ones with backdoor flush draw raise. So having a backdoor flush draw is usually pretty good. Pretty good. We see random ace 7 raising some portion of the time. It's hard to find a lot of bluffs. It's hard to find bluffs in this spot, and a lot of people choose the very wrong bluffs. They choose stuff like 9-7 or 7-4, and you see these hands just don't check raise that often at all. So in this spot, because we are shallow stacked, you're going to find a lot of the bottom pair type hands do raise too, or middle pairs raise too. So we see bottom and middle pairs with kickers that are almost always live like to raise. Let's take a look at what happens. I'm curious. Say we do check raise to 4.7 big blinds, and then we get jammed. Notice all the pairs call. Well, all the pairs, the bottom pairs with live kickers call. A lot of people don't like that. They don't like to check raise the 6-5 on the 10-6-3, get jammed, and then call. But those are calls, okay? So anyway, let's go back to this. Let's presume we do face the small bet. Let's presume we call. What hands are calling on this board that are medium for us, or medium for the big blind? Middle pairs call a ton, especially with the higher kickers, the more likely to be dominated kickers. The sixes call a lot, and random overcards call a lot, right? Not a whole lot of junk calls, right? I mean, we see like Queen Jack is calling, but that's actually a pretty good hand because it has 6 live outs plus backdoor outs. Not a lot of calling from anything else, though, right? I mean, we see the gut shots calling. That's important to note. Gut shots are all calling. They are not folding. So we'll say we do call, and the turn is bad for us. What's a bad turn? Take a second. Think about it. I'm going to have a cup of tea. What's bad for the big blind? Well, overcards can be bad for the big blind, right? Let's put an ace up there. It's a terrible card. They got to check, and now the low jack actually gets to bet every single time because they have all these good aces. It's a detrimentally terrible card for the big blind. And look, sometimes you can get a really bad card, and you have to check, fold, and lose. It's annoying, but it is what it is. Notice the low jack actually gets to bet kind of small here a lot of the time. When the turn is just extremely good for you, you usually don't mind putting in a small bet because your entire range is heavily favored. That said, 5 big blinds, so 2/3 pot is used a lot too. Let's say we bet tiny. Notice a lot of folds, 56% of the time against even a tiny 2 big blind bet. We are shoving, though, with our best hands that are likely good. And some draws. What are the draws now? Draws are going to be open-endeds, right? This is just stone gut shot, check shove sometimes. Stone gut shot, check shove sometimes. That's aggressive. But notice our shoving range is pretty strong, so we need to find some bluffs. Kind of cool to see 4-2 shoving over 9-8, though, right? And that's the stuff you can learn by studying the solver. All right, let's say instead we face a 5 big blind bet. Now we have to fold a lot, up to 70%, right? And now we're not calling all that often. When we do call, by the way, we have pairs, right? We have some aces, we have some 10s. A lot of the 6s fold. The ones with the most live kickers stick around, right? So that's cool to see. Let's suppose the turn is instead not detrimentally terrible. Let's put up a great turn. What's a great turn for the big blind? So on the flop, bet, small, call. What is a great turn? I think a 6 is going to be a great turn. Because look, if you look at this range, they have a lot of 6s, right? A 6 is going to be an excellent turn. What about like a 9, 8, or a 7? Maybe a 7. I think a 7 is probably pretty good. Let's take a look at the 6 first. I bet we're going to see a lot of leads. And sure enough, we do see a lot of leads, right? Because they have a lot of 6s. So the 6s are leading. And now, when you lead with the 6, you're also going to lead with a bunch of bluffs. So what are bluffs at this spot now that completely lack showdown value, usually? Well, that's going to be the gut shots and the open-endeds. So we see a lot of the 9, 7, 9, 8, whatever, using this bet. Say we do bet this 6 turn. Oh, I clicked the wrong button again. Say we do bet, and we get called. Notice not a lot of raises because you can't raise in the spot because your opponent's range is super polarized. Notice stuff like ace high has to call here, though. Like ace 8 calling against a 2/3 pot lead, that feels dirty. If your opponent's going to fold out a lot of these hands that are calling, you should actually be leading a whole lot more. I actually ran a spot similar to this in my advanced tournament course at pokercoaching.com, and you can lead almost everything if your opponent folds out a little bit too much, which is fun to see. Anyway, say they do call. Rivers, whatever, 2 of clubs. We can now bet or shove basically everything. Basically everything. We do have to have a few give-ups, but we do get to bet basically everything. What about on a 10? It's not going to be a great card because the opponent's going to have some 10s, right? So now we have to do more checking. What about on a ace? Ace is obviously bad. We have to do a lot of checking, right? So you can start to see patterns like this where the river's bad for us, so we don't get to bet as often. Or the river's great for us, so we get to bet more often. What's a really good river for us? Maybe a 7? Apparently not. Weird. Why do we not like a 7? I guess we have a lot of marginal hands now, right? I guess a lot of these hands improve. That's funny to see. I would not have predicted that. So now we're just going to try to check with a lot of hands and realize our equity, right? So say we check and they bet. Now we have to call off with a lot of 7s. So that's cool. So like the 7 actually increased a lot of our equity to the point that we get to check call. Neat. Neat, neat, neat. Let's talk about what happens when it goes check, check on the flop, and then we'll move on to another spot. Check, check on the flop. Actually, let's say check, check, And now the turn is whatever. But let's put up a king. You should already think, whose turn range does this king favor? Well, it's going to be the low jack, right? Because they're going to have a lot of kings in their range that they check back the flop with. So they check, and now we start to bet kind of polarized on the turn, right? What if instead the turn was 5? That's going to be better for the big blind, right? So now the big blind gets to bet a ton. So you saw, against a king turn, you bet none when it goes check, check on the flop. But on a 5 turn, you bet 74% of the time. Good to see, good to know, right? What about a 6? Another good spot, because we're going to have a lot of 6s, and the opponent has almost none. What about a jack? Terrible. Flop. The low jack's going to check back the flop a lot of the time, and that forces us to check a lot. They're going to bet polarized, as they should. And now we're stuck in the spot where we have to do a lot of folding, right? Because the turn is very, very bad for us. And this is a common thing you're going to see over and over and over. Whenever the card's good for you, when it goes check, check on the flop, you're usually plowing money in. And when the turn is not good for you, you do not do a whole lot of plowing of the money in. You just do a lot of checking and folding. Let's actually go back to what happens when the turn is the 6. We do a lot of betting here. Let's say we bet 5.5 big blinds. Opponent calls. And now the river is what? Let's say 2. Notice, again, a ton of betting. And when we are using this all-in strategy here, notice 3/4 pot all-in, we're betting with all of our best hands, which is going to be a 10 and better here, right? Every 10 bets. Do the 3s bet? Even the 3s bet. That's kind of cool. All the pairs bet, I guess. And then our lowest bluffs are usually some of the first ones to bluff. Not always, but usually. So we see a lot of these 9 high, 8 high, 8 high, 7 high hands doing a lot of bluffing, but not so much bluffing with the ace high and the king high and the queen high, right? Ace high, king high, and queen high actually win some small portion of the time when it checks down. So you don't want to bluff those. You want to bluff with the lowest showdown value ones for the most part. That's usually going to be the ideal strategy. Say we do check and the opponent goes all in. Look at that, thin all in with the 9s, huh? 8s, shoves, and some bluffs. Say they do go all in. Now we do a whole lot of folding though, despite this, because like ace 8 can win at the showdown, but probably not. Notice our checking range here is really trash, and we only call off with ace high. Everything else folds. Okay? Look, again, I realize there's a lot to take in here, but a big takeaway is the range good, or is the board good for my range? If the board is good for my range, put money in the pot. If the board is not good for your range, don't put so much money in the pots. All right, we're gonna take a look now at a spot that is particularly bad for the initial. Now let's discuss a situation where the pre-flop raiser is not favored much at all. This is going to be when the board does not connect with the pre-flop raiser's range very well, and instead it connects very well with the pre-flop caller. And this is usually going to be when the board is all 3 low, generally connected cards. So on the flop, the pre-flop caller is going to lead a decent amount of the time with a polarized range. If they check, the pre-flop raiser is going to bet very infrequently because they're not favored, and they're going to be very polarized, right? The pre-flop caller, after they check, they're going to fold pretty infrequently against a bet, and they're going to do a lot of raising because, again, they're the ones who are favored, right? On the turn, after it goes check, bet, call, or bet, call, the flop bettors usually going to be betting pretty polarized, but with a lot of their range, because whatever range they bet with should be quite strong, right? And you're going to find the flop caller sticks around a decent amount. On the river, if someone bet the turn, they're usually betting very polarized, and the turn caller is going to fold some portion of the time. So we're going to look at 7-6-5, which is one of the absolute best boards for the pre-flop caller. Realize that most other scenarios are not going to be this dramatic, but I wanted to show you this very, well, this board that's excellent for the big blind caller. So let's take a look at this. Flop comes 7-6-5. Notice the big blind should lead 65% of the time. That is a lot. What are they leading with? Well, looks like a little bit of everything, right? A little bit of everything goes for leads. Which hands mostly lead? Well, it's going to be pairs and draws. Pairs and draws are going to be doing a lot of leading. A lot of hands with an 8 are going to lead. A lot of hands with a 9 are going to lead. A lot of hands with a 4 are going to lead. A lot of hands with a 3 are going to lead. Also, a lot of hands with a pair are going to lead. Notice a lot of 7s bet, a lot of 6s bet, lots of 5s bet. Notice you really prefer to bet with pairs that have a gut shot or an open-ended, right? Like we see 8-5 betting almost every time, whereas Jack 5 bets often but less frequently. Looks like the overcards are mostly not betting. Overcards without any sort of backdoor draw are not doing a whole lot of betting. Total air balls, ace 2, king 2, these are not doing a whole lot of betting. Okay, lots of betting is being used. Let's take a look what happens when they do bet small. Notice not a lot of raising, but also not a lot of folding. So this is a little bit different than the previous scenarios where the player who is disadvantaged has to favor a fold a lot, because now we're facing a small bet and we're in position. Remember, we faced a 1.4 big blind bet, right? Into a 5.5 big blind pot. So we're getting amazing odds and we're in position. Amazing odds plus position results in you not folding all that often. Position is very, 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 very powerful. So in this spot, we are facing a raise from a bet from a decently strong range. So we're going to be mostly raising large or shoving with our hands that are almost always good but vulnerable, plus a few sporadic bluffs. So let's take a look at this. Ace 7 shoves. Jacks, 10s, and 9s shove or raise. And then we have a few bluffs with King 8, Ace 9, Ace 8, and that's about it. Notice if we do raise with Ace 9, it's mostly shove, but some small raises. We do have some small raises in these spots. Say we do raise small with the Ace 9, and then we get shoved. Notice we have to call it off with all this stuff. We're really only folding out with the small slivers of nonsense. Most people do not find the small slivers of nonsense in this situation to raise, which is worth noting, right? Okay, so if we do shove here, what should the opponent call off with? We led the flop kind of polarized. We basically call off with all of our pairs. All of our pairs are calling off for the most part here, just because all of our pairs are in pretty good shape. We're only folding out pairs that have a kicker that is very disassociated from the board. Notice a lot of our pairs have pairs and draws, all those call. Interesting to see that like Jack 6 with a backdoor flush draw calls, but Jack 6 without a backdoor flush draw folds. So the backdoor equity is important, right? Backdoor draws and gut shots and whatnot are very, very important. Notice all the Queen 6 for the most part folds, because none of those Queen 6 offsuits have no backdoor flush draw, right? That said, 7s are good enough to call off for the most part. Interesting to see some 7s, Queen 7 and Jack 7 actually fold. I'm surprised at that. But whatever. Notice the best 8s are going to call it off. 8s with backdoor draws all call it off. Ace Jack randomly with all the Ace Jacks call it off for fun. Notice the 3s and the 4s are doing a lot of folding, right? Bad straight draws are not particularly good. Notice the gut shots to the 9 are all folding as well. Those are not going to be good enough to call against the shove. All right, what happens if we check instead? We are going to check the flop some. Notice we're playing a very mixed strategy here, so when we do check, we're still going to have a decently strong range. Now, the low jack does not get to bet all that often. They're only betting 40% of the time, and when they do bet, it is super polarized. This is what a polarized range looks like, by the way. We're betting all of our best hands that are almost always vulnerable, top pair, good kicker, and better. And then we're going to bet some draws. Draws here are going to be lots of 9s and 8s and a bunch of sporadic junk that has some equity, right? Notice aces and kings check back to hopefully protect the rest of our junky checking range. We're betting queens, jacks, 10s, and 9s and 8s because those are almost always good but vulnerable, whereas aces and kings are way less vulnerable, right? They have to worry about fewer overcards. Let's say we do make our small bet. Notice, by the way, our big bets are mostly going to be the hands that are most vulnerable. So we see 10s almost always betting 5.5 big blinds, whereas if we take a hand like 8-7, it's just a worse hand in general. That hand is going to be mostly betting 1.4 big blinds. So when you're using the solver, it's important to realize that the ranges we bet 5.5 compared to 1.4 with may be very different, and that's going to impact the opponent's strategy a lot. Let's see, actually. Say we bet 1.4 big blinds. Say we bet 1.4 big blinds. We see not a lot of folding and a lot of raising, right? Lots of raising with all sorts of pairs and draws. What if instead we bet 5.5 big blinds? Now we're going to see a ton of folding, right? And not, well, I guess we do still see a lot of raising, but not a ton of raising, but a lot of folding. And we have to fold a lot more against the 5.5 big blind bet because the 5.5 big blind bet will be a stronger range, right? Notice that we still do just get it in pretty wide. Any pair is good enough. Pair plus draw is in. Lots of 8s are in. Because all those hands have pretty good equity. So let's go back to this facing a small bet. I think most people do typically bet small here. Say we do bet small, and let's say the low jack, or the big blind calls. Let's say the turn is a blank, like a 2. We do still see a tiny bit of leading, but not a lot. We check. Now, because we bet the flop very, very polarized in the low jack, we're now going to be betting the turn with a lot of our range because our range was very strong to begin with, right? So because our range was strong to begin with, we get to keep betting very frequently. So say we do bet 5 big blinds. We're going to start to see a decent amount of folding now. And now that we're using kind of a big size, you don't see a ton of raising. Let's say they do call. Notice they are calling with a lot of pairs. Some draws, right? Makes a lot of sense. Notice the 9-8 has been slow playing pretty hard for the straight, which is cool to see. Say the river is another 2. Interestingly enough, we do have some 2s here. It's kind of odd to me to see leads in this scenario. This is what I definitely would have played wrong in the low jack shoe or in the big blind shoes, which is good. This is why you got to study. I'm shocked to see the queen 6 lead here. Seems bizarre. Let's presume we check though. Very polarized, bet all in, and calling logically with pairs and some ace high. Let's suppose instead the river's a 2. Let's suppose we led. Look at this. I already foresaw this happening. If you lead here, who's this? This is the low jack. The low jack's supposed to shove with basically any good pair, right? Plus some bluffs. Cool to see, right? So why are we leading so much? You're gonna find that from out of position, you typically do like to lead small. And I bet if we gave the solver smaller options, notice we only gave 4.6 as the smallest option. If you give the solver too many options, the solution becomes gigantic and it takes forever to run it. But if we gave like a 1 big blind bet here or 2 big blind bet here, I bet it would use smaller sizes even more often in this spot. You're going to find that's a common strategy from out of position. Anyway, let's say we do bet here and we do get jammed. You do see we call it off with pairs and fold the bluffs. Okay? Let's say instead we bet small on the flop. Or the big blind bet small on the flop, low jack calls. Let's make the turn really good for the big blind. Let's say the turn is a 3. We're going to see a ton of betting, basically every time. And we're usually betting small. This is a spot where the big blind's equity goes through the roof because now they have a lot of straights. This is going to be the same case on a 4. We do see a lot of betting too. Not quite as much because now the 8 is a straight and the initial raiser does have the 8 in the range we saw. What about on a 8? Not so much, but still a lot. We do have a lot of straights, but they have the 9s, right? What about on a 9? Now we don't at all because while we did have some 8s, the opponent has a lot of 8s, right? And they now have a lot of top pairs and whatnot too. So we see a lot of checking on the 9. So we see here the 3 on the flop or on the turn is particularly great for the big blind. What about a 5? Not so much because now all their overpairs and all their ace highs are pretty good, right? What about on a 7? Not so much, right? Typically people think whenever the board pairs, it's good for the big blind, but not so much if your opponent has a lot of that stuff in their range, and now their overpairs and ace high get very good. So say we do check, notice here, here's their range, right? They have a lot of overpairs facing the flop, small flop lead. So against the small flop lead, they have all these hands that are just super duper good. Plus they have some 7s too. So you always have to consider how does each player's range line up with each other. Say they do make a 5 big blind bet. If they get jammed on, obviously they call off with their good hands, fold their junk. That's the nice thing about using a polarized strategy. Say they bet 5 big blinds and get called though. River is I don't know, let's put a queen up there. River's a queen. Now we see a whole lot of checking from out of position and a whole lot of shoving from the low jack. And then they have to call it off with pairs and whatnot. Notice here, the 9-8 was doing its best to protect the calling range by slow playing hard. And that's just because, look, whenever you have the super nuts and your opponent's applying aggression, you really, 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 really need to try to protect your passive calling range. So pretty cool to see. Despite that, we still have to call off with stuff like a 5 some portion of the time, which is kind of gross. Notice queen 5 calls every time, even though it is dominated to pair, because it blocks the opponent's full houses a little bit, which is nice. Notice ace 8's calling, ace jack's calling. Ugh. So look, in general, in tournaments, you're going to want to shy away from calling it off in spots where the solver's using very mixed strategies, just because you don't want to put all your money in a marginal spot. That said, if your opponent is hyper aggressive and loves to bluff, they're going to look at this queen of diamonds river and think, all right, I got to go for it. Well, then may have to find a lot of wide calls. On paired boards, you're going to find that the strategy is rather interesting because there's already a super duper nut hand available that is unlikely to change on the later betting rounds. Because if you have trips, it's almost always good. Boards where there are 3 cards of the same suit available also play interestingly as well. We're not going to discuss those today, but definitely check out those in your own time. We have a lot of simulations discussing how to play those on pokercoaching.com. So let's discuss paired boards. On the flop, the preflop raiser usually bets frequently because they often have a range advantage because the preflop caller usually just misses the flop. But when they bet, they're usually betting tiny because very often they lack the nut advantage to some extent. You're going to find the preflop caller folds a decent amount, but raises pretty often when they do stick around because when they have trips, they just want to load money into the pot. And then from there, the hands play out where players just keep putting money in, very polarized. So I want to look at 2 different boards here because they're very different. Low jack against big blind, if you just consider their ranges, right? On queen, queen 2, the low jack's going to have a lot of trips. Okay? What about on 6-3-3? Well, on 6-3-3, the low jack's going to have almost no trips. And that's going to result in these spots playing very differently, even though they're both paired boards. We're not going to spend a ton of time on these, but I wanted to show you how these spots are very, very different. So queen, queen 2, big blind checks, low jack bets everything tiny, 1.4 big blinds. And take a look at this. Tons of folds and tons of raises and literally no calls. Hopefully this is enlightening to you. On queen, queen 2, a lot of players in the big blind check and call with all sorts of stuff. But if you take a look at this, they do have a lot of queens, but they also have a lot of junk. And because of that, they get to raise small and frequently. Notice the opponent bet 1.4, we're raising to 4.7. I would venture to say a smaller raise might even be better. I've studied these spots a decent amount, and some of my opponents always act confused whenever I put in the small minimum check raise, and they're like, what is going on here? But the answer is, this is what you're supposed to do. So notice we're check raising all of our pairs, right? All the pairs check raise, all the trips check raise, and then some draws. What are draws on queen, queen 2? Well, these are going to be draws that wrap around either the queen or the 2. So we have king X with backdoor flush draws. We have ace X with backdoor flush draws. And then we have 6X, 4X, and 3X with backdoor flush draws. Those are our bluffs. Simple, easy peasy. Say we do check raise. Say we do check raise. Notice the low jack has to call a ton. Way more than you may think. And most people drastically overfold here. Drastically. If you give them the jack 9 backdoor draw, they just put it in the muck every time. Which is great. Lets you check raise very aggressively. King 10 backdoor draw. Most people muck it. Notice king jack with no backdoor draw, mostly folds. Lots of ace highs call, especially with backdoor draws. Notice not a lot of shoving. We're not shoving a lot because the big blind has a lot of queens, right? Interestingly enough, the hands that shove, 7, 6s, and 5s. I would not have expected those to shove all that often, but if you think about it, they're probably good but vulnerable. Remember, we're only playing 20 big blinds deep, right? Anyway, suppose we call. Turn is whatever. Let's say it's a 6. Now, once we check raise with a kind of wide range and the opponent does call, what does the caller have to have? They have to have something decent, right? So because of that, we don't get to bet all that often. And when we do keep betting, we're usually going to be very polarized. Also, the 6 of clubs is not great for the low jack, or I'm sorry, the big blind, because while some of their draws did improve, and those are going to bet every time, a lot of their other draws up here, the king highs don't really improve, and the ace highs don't really improve. Let's say instead the turn was the jack of spades. Now we see a lot of shoves. Why are we shoving a lot? Because we have a lot of high equity draws up here, right? Notice now we have a lot of gut shots that have very good equity. And we also have a lot of flush draws that don't mind ripping it in. We do still check some queens, though. I want to make it clear. Whenever you check raise the flop with everything, you should be checking the turn with a lot of ace highs and trips. Those are and bottom pairs. Those are going to be hands that like to check a decent amount of the time. What about a 10 of hearts? We're going to see a similar thing. Makes logical sense, right? What about a 9 of hearts? Not so much anymore, because now we do have some gut shots, but not quite as many, I suppose. So notice on the turns that are really good for us, or at least turns that give us lots of really high equity draws, we are shoving a lot, like on the 10 of hearts. But on the 9 of hearts, we are mostly betting small, and all the other cards are mostly going to bet small. Let's say we have like a 4 of diamonds. It's all going to be small bets, right? Or 8 of hearts, all small bets. What about a king? I don't know. King of hearts mixes it up. Cool to see. What about ace of hearts? Small bet, because now the low jack has a lot of ace X, right? All right, so let's suppose we bet the opponent raises small, we call. Actually, that's the only way this hand plays out, isn't it? That's fun to see. We call, and the turn's whatever it is, and then the low jack goes. So let's say the turn is one of the blanky ones. The big blind checks. Now the low jack's going to be betting polarized, right? Best made hands and draws, which is what you're always going to see. When you get check two, after your opponent's range should already be kind of strong, you're always going to be betting polarized. So we do bet. Some shoves with queens. Notice some shoves with bluffs, like king jack. Most people don't find the bluffs here. With queen, jack 10, jack 9, and 10-9 for gut shot shove. That's cool to see. Lots of calls though. Say the river's a 5 of clubs. Check. Polarized shove again, or polarized bet all in. And logical call with pairs, basically. Pairs call, other hands fold. Okay. Let's take a look at 6-3-3. So we now still check everything from the big blind. Low jack bets, but less often. Why are they betting less often on 6-3-3 compared to queen, 2? Well, now they just have way fewer trips, right? And the big blind now has more trips, so they don't get to bet as often. When it does check, say the turn is a 9, lots of polarized betting from the big blind. Say they do bet. They're going to get called logically. Notice here, we do have to call perhaps wider than you maybe used to. Like king high is pretty good. Ace high is pretty good, especially with overcards. You really want to have overcards to the 9. Overcards to the 9 with showdown value is pretty good. Let's say we do call. River's a 7 of clubs. Probably going to see a ton of betting, right? Yeah, we see a ton of betting. Why is there a ton of betting here? Well, they have a lot of 3s, and also they improve to a lot of pairs and straights and whatnot, right? So this lets them bet everything on the 7 of clubs. What about the jack of clubs? Not nearly as much, because all these hands down here missed. They have a ton of garbage. When your range contains a ton of garbage, you have to do a lot of checking. All right, let's suppose, though, we do make the small bet on the flop from the low jack. Now, remember, on queen, 2, we check raised everything and folded like 60-something% of the time. On 6-3-3, though, we're calling way more because now we have a whole lot of hands that have decent equity that are getting the right price to continue. Because on 6-3-3, hands like king jack offsuit are good enough to continue. But on queen, 2, hands like 9-8 are not. So, as you have a range of hands that has just more equity in general, you don't want to raise as often. Now, we still are raising a lot of the time. Notice we are raising with a lot of 3s and a lot of 6s and a lot of backdoor draws and front door draws, right? Whenever you are raising small and your range is very, very strong, you can raise stuff like 7-5 and 5-4 because now you're less concerned about getting re-raised off of it. What happens if we do raise 5-4 and get shoved? Say we do raise. We're not going to get shoved all that often. Say we do get shoved. We do have to call it off with the 5-4, just so you know. So it's not like you're not loving it there, but you do got to call it off if you do put in the raise. But you don't really want to be there, which is why you don't bet it every single time, right? Okay, so say we do bet, face a 1.4 bet, the opponent calls. Now the turn is a jack. They check every time. This is bad for the big blind. Now we see a ton of betting because the jack is bad for the big blind, right? What about on a turn ace? What do you think? Lots of betting because it's bad for the big blind. What about a turn 5? Does the big blind lead here? They might. They do. Look, they do lead sometimes here. Lots of 5s, lots of 6s, lots of 7s. Gut shots. Some random 2s. Whew, that's a dirty one. Dirty gut shots leading. 3s do a lot of checking, funny enough. So anyway, they check a lot of the time, though. They check, and we're betting polarized, right? Because this is not so good for us. So you see these patterns occurring over and over where when the turn is really good for one player, that player is usually doing a lot of betting. When the turn is not good for a player, they usually do a ton of checking. And that's a pattern that just comes up over and 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 over again. All right, let's discuss bubble play now. Now let's discuss playing on the bubble. The bubble is when you're playing a tournament and the next person out gets no money and everybody else who remains in the tournament gets in the money. Usually they get paid 1.5 times their buy-in or maybe 2 buy-ins. Some people think that they should go way out of their way to try to get in the money. Some people think they should not care about that 1.5 buy-ins at all, and both of those players are usually wrong. In general, as play progresses, as you get closer and closer to getting in the money, you should be willing to pass up on small edges that win some small amount of chips in exchange for making it more likely you get in the money. And this often means no longer 3-betting with marginal hands before the flop, raising for thin value post-flop, value betting thinly for large amounts, especially on the turn in the river, and also bluffing for large amounts. Basically, you want to play a whole lot of small pots when it gets to become bubble time, because if you play one big pot and you lose, you're either going to be a short stack on the bubble, which is not great, or you're going to be out and everybody else gets in the money. That said, do not make drastic adjustments too soon. In a tournament in 2023, where we are today, most tournaments pay something like 15% of the players in the field. So if you're down to something like 30% of the players remaining, maybe you make small adjustments, but you shouldn't really be making drastic adjustments unless you're a big stack against another big stack and you don't want to get in there and collide stacks, which you usually don't. But if you have a medium stack and you probably need to get a double up between now and when you get in the money to have any chance of getting in the money anyway, you shouldn't really worry about the bubble so much. That said, if there is 18% of the field remaining, you probably want to start being kind of tight, because if just a small number of people bust, you're going to be in the money. In general, as the big stack, you can play more aggressively on the bubble in spots where your medium and short stacked opponents are highly incentivized to not go broke. As the medium and short stacks, though, you usually want to make a point to get in the money, especially when you start to get kind of close to the money. And when you're really near the money, you should be making gigantic, extreme, drastic adjustments that most people don't make. One time in, I think it was EPT Monte Carlo, a long time ago, I think we were on day 3, and in the middle of day 3, we were going to get in the money. But for whatever reason, one player was not there, and he had been blinding out. And he had one big blind left. He was going to literally be out of the tournament on the next hand when he took his big blind. So everyone's in the money except for this guy. All you have to do is fold a hand. Take a hand off, and you get in the money. But for whatever reason, at one of the other tables, 2 players decided to get it all in for 40 big blinds each. One with queens, one with ace king. They just decided to ram and jam it in there. And one of them lost and bubbled. And that player, who was not even there, who had one big blind, who was out of the tournament next hand, won a minimum cash for something like 15,000 euros. That was a blunder for those 2 players with ace king, because they just handed that player 15,000 euros, essentially, right? And that is a big, big, big mistake. So when you're really near the bubble, you're going to find that sometimes the adjustments you need to make are extreme. Now look, studying and analyzing bubble scenarios is actually really difficult, because it depends on how many chips everyone has in the tournament. Because imagine you're playing with, let's say, 20 people left and 19 get in the money. If one of the players has one big blind, that's going to play very differently than if the shortest stack has 25 big blinds, right? And so that makes studying these spots super duper tough. But these general tips here are going to go a long way to ensuring when you have a short or medium stack, you don't get yourself in too much trouble. And if you know, as a big stack, you usually do want to be applying small amounts of aggression, usually not all-in aggression, because if your opponent wants to put their money in, you are dead, right? So you're usually going to be using a lot more small bets, but you are going to be playing more aggressively in general. I want to take a look at a spot. Say we are in a situation on the stone bubble of a tournament. Okay? Stone bubble means the next person out gets nothing. Everybody else gets something. Big stack, loose aggressive player raises. Well, right here, you would obviously just be all in normally in a 20 big blind scenario, right? You can use the Poker Coaching Preflop app to see that. But here we are on the bubble. So we want to look around at this table and see, are there any super duper shallow stacks? Also, am I in decent position? Meaning, like, is 20 big blinds good here? So take a look around here. We have a 3 big blind stack under the gun. All right, we're going to have to be kind of tight. These 2 players both have a lot. This player has 15 big blinds. This player has 8. This player has 30. This player has 13. So we're actually in okay shape with our 20 big blind stack. And this player is going to be out soon, or they're going to have to win 2 or 3 hands in a row. So look, this is a spot where if you're on the absolute bubble of a tournament, this is just a fold. And as there are more and more players in the field, this is even closer and closer and closer to a fold, because inevitably at the other tables, there'll be other short stacks, right? So here, we are basically a lock to get in the money. We are going to get in the money every time. And don't screw it up. You got to realize, even if we do shove and they fold, or they shove and we get a double up, it is not worth the risk of bubbling the tournament. So this is just a fold. Don't even call. Don't even try to see the flop. Just be done with it. And I know this may seem tight and seem passive and seem weak, but with a medium / shallowish stack, a lot of the value you have in this tournament is collecting your free minimum cash. And then once you get in the money, you can go nuts because now the payout jumps are minimal until you get very, very deep in the tournament. So look for spots like this. Also, in the loose aggressive big stack scenario, some people make the mistake of open shoving every hand. And that's going to be a mistake too, because whenever you run into one of the bigger stacks, aces or kings, that's just not going to fold, well, now you go from having a big stack on the bubble to being in horribly bad shape, right? Or at least way worse shape. So you're going to find that usually the right play for the big stack is use lots of min raises. And then if somebody calls, say the big blind calls, you're going to want to use a lot of small and frequent betting because you want to do everything you can to kind of force your opponent to have to put their stack in or feel like they have to put their stack in. And you don't actually have to use all that big of bets to do that. So this is very, 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 very basic initial guide to playing on the bubble. But if you use these tips, it's going to go a long way to helping you sneak into the money a little bit more often and also push around your opponents a little bit more often on the bubble. And that's going to result in you winning a whole lot more money. Now let's discuss playing the final table. It's important to realize that when you are fortunate enough to make it to the final table, your goal should not necessarily be to win the tournament, even though winning the tournament pays the most money. Because when you play in a style that will result in you winning the tournament a lot of the time, you will inevitably bust early a lot of the time, and you'll miss out on a whole lot of second and third place finishes. I know that some people play for the glory and they want to get a bunch of titles, but quite often you want to play in a manner that will result in you, well, you do want to play in a manner that will result in you winning as much money as possible if you are a good, strong professional poker player, because the goal is to win money, not trophies. Trophies look fun and they're cool and they may make you feel good, but you do not want to win them in exchange for sacrificing a lot of equity. Okay? So, as a big stack, at a final table, you usually are going to want to look to push around the middle and the short stacks. I'm going to show you how to do this before the flop with the Poker Coaching Preflop app in just a second. As a middle stack, you're going to want to look to push around the shorter stacks while very much so avoiding the big stacks. And as a short stack, you're going to want to look to outlast the other short stacks while at the same time looking to get all in preflop with a decent hand against what is likely a very wide range. In all these situations, though, you're going to find that you really don't want to get all in, because when you get all in at a final table and bust, that's going to result in everybody else at the table winning some money. So you're going to find that when it comes to playing for all the money, you have to be quite cautious in general at a final table. So let's first discuss playing the final table as a big stack. We have this program here. This is the Poker Coaching Preflop app. I have it set up for ICM with a 1 big blind ante. This is like when you're playing a live tournament. We have small ante charts, which are a little bit different here. This is when you're playing online. And then we have a few situations already loaded up, and we're going to consistently add more to this library. We have 3-way spots and 5-way spots. So the way you read this is you have, let's say 10 big blinds, 20 big blinds, 30 big blinds, 15, and 50. This means the hijack seat, first act has 10, the cutoff has 20, the button has 30, the small blind has 15, and the big blind has 50. And you're going to find that all these scenarios play very differently based on where each specific stack is situated, because as there are more big stacks yet to act, you inevitably must play a little bit tighter if those players can bust you. So let's just take a look at how we would play as the big stack in, let's do this scenario. So in this situation, under the gun has 60 big blinds. We're going to be focusing on them. The cutoff has 30. The button has 15, kind of short. The small blind has 45, and the big blind has 20. Okay, so the way you use this is, under the gun, we're going to raise with this range. Focus on this top left-hand chart. So under the gun, we are going to min raise with 43% of hands, which is a ton, an absolute ton. Remember the charts earlier. On the button, in a lot of scenarios, the widest you could range was something like 43% of hands. But here, we can do it in the hijack seat because we have a big stack. If there were shallower stacks at this table, we would be raising even wider. So definitely be aware of that. This is a situation where we are going to be raising very, very wide as the big stack. So suppose we do raise. You click this button right here. And now it says what the cutoff should do. Notice the cutoff should have almost no calling range, 30 big blinds deep. They should be re-raising or folding pretty much everything. Interesting to see. Suppose they do re-raise. In this scenario, they do re-raise, back around to under the gun. Notice in this scenario, this is a chart we want to be looking at. We raise, this is how we're going to proceed. We are going to re-raise tiny with some king X suiteds and some nuts. We're going to rip it all in with some low ace X suiteds and some hands that are likely good but vulnerable. Then we're going to call with our absolute, or hands that flop the absolute best, right? But we're going to be doing a lot of folding, even as the big stack in this situation. Okay, so you see we're doing a lot of folding with a lot of the ace X offsuit. You're going to find that in general, ace X is a hand that does like to apply aggression when it makes sense. And we do see a lot of the suited aces here just ripping it in for the opponent's 30 big blinds, right? Suppose we do go all in. You can click this button right here. Here's how the cutoff should respond. They should now call with the best hands, fold everything else. Okay? But you do see, this is a scenario where we are opening very, very wide preflop, which is what I wanted to show you. Primarily is that when we are going to be raising pretty wide. When we get 3-bet, we do have to stick around a decent amount. Let's say we do raise minimum. Let's suppose now the cutoff folds. And now let's suppose the button goes all in, mostly with this range. This is the short stack for 15 big blinds. They shove 15 big blinds. Now, here's what we call off with in this situation. Pretty tight calling range, I think, for 15 big blinds in most people's eyes, but it is usually what we're going to want to do in this scenario because we just don't want to find ourselves calling off against a range that should be kind of strong. Okay? Let's go back and look at this spot one more time. Suppose we raise minimum. Cutoff folds. Notice they are folding a ton. Notice the button folds. They're folding a ton. Now the small blind, the big stack, is here with 45 big blinds. Notice they actually don't do much 3-betting at all. They 3-bet almost never. You may say, why are they 3-betting almost never? Well, they really, really, really don't want to go broke against us. And when they do 3-bet, it's almost always with the ace X and king X suited blockers. Say they do actually 3-bet. Here's now our strategy. We, with 60 big blinds, really don't apply a whole lot of aggression either. If we do shove, it's literally only with ace king offsuit and a few low suited ace X suiteds. Or a few ace X suiteds. And if we do shove, look, they have to even fold out stuff like 8s and 5s and ace queen against our shove, knowing they're going to be very dominating us. Or they're going to be dominating us, right? Because if they have ace queen, and I just literally announced them, I have ace king and a bunch of low ace X suiteds, you may be surprised to see hands like 9s and 8s and 7s folding because they are going to be dominating us or flipping every time. But they cannot take the risk of busting before these other shallow stacks. Let's take a look at a different scenario now. Let's take a look at this one. Here we have 25 big blinds in the hijack, 30 in the cutoff, 10 on the button, 40 in the small blind, and 15 in the big blind. What I want to know is what happens when they fold around to us with the big stack and the small blind. Well, you see here, when they fold to us with the big stack and the small blind, we go all in or raise with everything. We go all in or we raise with literally every single hand in our range besides the absolute trash. Now, why are we getting to play every single hand in our range? With us mostly jamming the majority of the time. Well, we are doing that because notice there's a 10 big blind stack in this situation, and the 15 big blind stack really, really, really wants to outlast the 10 big blind stack. So we get to shove incredibly wide. You're going to find that when you are the big stack, you get to shove very aggressively when it folds to you in the small blind. Let's take a look at another spot here where we're not necessarily the big stack. Notice stacks are 60, 30, 15, 20, 45, and 20. If it goes under the gun fold, cutoff fold, button fold, well, now we see the small blind again gets to be super aggressive. Now, in this scenario, they do have to fold a little bit more often. Why do they have to fold more often? Well, now the short stack only has 15 big blinds instead of 10, and the big blind has 20 instead of 15. But you do see they still get to shove a lot, 53% of the time. They get to shove very, 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 very aggressively. With some small raising thrown in there too. All right, let's take a look at one more scenario where it's 20 big blinds, 30 big blinds, 60 big blinds, 15, and then 44. This is an interesting spot because the button does have a lot of chips, but so does the big blind. Despite that, though, we see the button gets to raise 63% of hands. With no payout implications, the most the button gets to raise is something like 50. And here we see them raising substantially wider than that because of the payout implications. This is a spot where they are going to be raising super duper wide. If they do raise, let's say small blind folds. Notice they're shove or fold only for the most part. This is the big blinds strategy with 44 big blinds. Notice they basically never 3-bet unless it's aces, kings, ace, king, or just a smattering of nonsense. Most people do not find any of the nonsense and they 3-bet aces and kings. But one thing worth noting is when it is big stack against big stack and there are a bunch of relatively shallow stacks at the table, hands like queens, jacks, tens, nines, they do not 3-bet. I think a lot of people automatically overvalue hands like queens, jacks, tens, nines in this scenario because they're normally pretty good. But when two big stacks are battling it out, they are not so much. Here's another example where it's 10, 20, 40, 15, 40. Okay, so let's take a look at 10, 20, 40, 15, 40. So we get to see 53% raises. You don't get to raise as often in this spot because we don't actually outchip the big blind. In the other spot, we had 60 and they had 44. Small blind folds. Notice again, big blind does not do much 3-betting at all when it's two 40 big blind stacks as the big stack, when there is a 10 and a 15 and a 20 big blind stack at the table, because neither 40 big blind stack really wants to go broke. If the big blind does 3-bet, notice the button 3-bets. I'm sorry, 4-bets. The button 4-bets, almost none. The button's 4-betting almost none because, again, they don't want to go broke. Neither of these players want to go broke at all. So whenever you have two big stacks against each other, neither player wants to actually take any sort of substantial risk. All right, so that is how the big stacks should play. Let's now take a look at how the middle stacks should play. The first spot I want to look at is here, where we have 10 big blinds, 20 big blinds, 30 big blinds, 15 big blinds, 15 big blinds, and then 50. So 10, 20, 30, 15, 50. So let's look at the 30 big blind stack strategy. I guess we can look at the 20 big blind stack strategy too. Notice the cutoff has to be super tight with 20 big blinds. They are not open shoving all that often, though. They're really only open shoving with very few hands in this situation. So lots of min raising, but a tight range in general. So let's say they fold. How should the 30 big blind stack, clearly second place, play on the button? Well, in this situation, the 30 big blind stack should play super duper tight, right? Because they really don't want to go broke before the three short stacks. So we see that they are only raising 31% of hands on the button, which may be surprising to some people because normally the button creates like 40-something% of hands. 45% of hands, 30 big blinds deep. But here, it's only 31 because they really don't want to go broke. Notice the hands that opt to not play, by the way, are a lot of the low suited connected type hands that would normally play. On the button, normally you get to play a lot of suited junk, but not so much. Also, the small pairs are not played all that often because they do not block the opponent's shoving ranges at all. And if you raise them, they have to fold to a shove because you just don't want to take risks in this spot as the middle stack. So say we do raise with the 30 big blind stack, and small blind short stack folds. Notice here what the big blind should do. This is, again, another scenario where you have to figure out how the big blind should play. But facing a raise from a middle stack, you see the big blind should be ripping it in a lot. And the selection of hands that rips it in is actually kind of weird, right? We see the low ace X suited, low king X suited, small pairs, ace X offsuit, king X offsuit that are bad, and this weird block of suited hands up here. Definitely an odd strategy. Confusing strategy. But it is what you should do, and the way you learn about these spots is by studying a lot away from the table. We also do see a very strong polarized 3-betting range going non-all-in this situation. Let's say we do go all-in, though, or we face an all-in. Here's what the button should call off with. Notice it's a super-duper tight range, 9s and better, ace-jack suited and better, and that's it. And that's because, again, the 30 big blind stack really does not want to go broke. All right, let's take a look at another scenario where now the stacks are 20, 30, 60, 20, 30, 60, 15, 44. Okay, so let's say under the gun, 20 big blind stack folds. Here's what the 30 big blind cutoff should raise with, which is a very strong range in this situation. They do open it up. The button now, with the big stack, is going to be 3-betting aggressively. Notice their range is 3-betting very polarized, and it very much skews towards the ace-X. This is what you will often want to be 3-betting with. Stuff like this, ace-X, even the offsuit ones, it turns out, are excellent 3-bet bluffing hands as the big stack because you block your opponent's shoving range. So let's say we do 3-bet. Here's the cutoff strategy. Cutoff strategy at this point now is to rip it all in with all the hands that they can play. And the reason for this is they can't really justify calling out of position against a 3-bet because they're going to drastically under-realize their equity. Now, we haven't talked about post-flop play much here at all, but essentially, every hand that is normally kind of neutral when there are no payout implications becomes a very, very clear fold when there are payout implications. And that's going to result in the short-stacked caller substantially under-realizing their equity post-flop, which is why you really don't see a whole lot of calling from out of position as a medium stack when you do get 3-bet at a final table. Instead, you do a whole lot of shoving or folding. Let's take a look at a slightly different spot where the stacks are 25, 30, 10, 40, and 15. So let's say 25 big blind stack folds, 30 min raises. The button now folds. The small blind re-raises. Notice here, small blind with 40 big blinds actually does do a decent amount of shoving, more than I would have naturally thought. But again, lots of ace-x suiteds, lots of good, strong king-x suiteds, etc. Those are shoving. Let's assume they do go non-all-in, though. Now you see the cutoff doing some calling, but again, not a ton. They get to call on the spot, though, because they are in position. When you're in position, you get to call a little bit more, well, a lot more than when you are out of position in these situations, okay? Definitely an important takeaway. Another very important takeaway is that the ace-x suited loves to shove. When you raise and somebody 3-bets and you have the ace-x suited, those are the hands that really, really, really err towards just ripping it in. One thing I want to look at, same scenario, 25, 30, 10, 40, 15. What happens when under the gun folds, cutoff min raises, button folds. Notice the button has to be super tight here, by the way, to shove for 10 big blinds. We'll talk about short stacks in a second. What happens when the small blind rips it in? What do you think we should call off with? Well, the answer is almost nothing. Nines and better, ace queen suited and better, and ace king. And the reason the cutoff with their 30 big blind stack has to call off so incredibly tightly, even though they know they're smashing their opponent's range, is because by calling, whenever you do call and lose, you just give tons of equity to the other stacks at the table, and that is absolutely detrimental. So as the middle stack, you'll see that you have to be very cautious when your opponent wants to put in all of your money, and also you should still be shoving some portion of the time, especially when you are out of position, when you are facing a raise. Do we want to look at one more spot? No, that's probably good for that stack depth. Let's take a look at how shallow stack should play now. Here we have 10, 20, 30, 15, 50. Under the gun with 10 big blinds, we see, interestingly enough, not only all in or fold for 10 big blinds, which is probably surprising to a lot of people. But notice the best hands are almost always min raising when you are somewhat shallow stacked with 10 big blinds. And you're instead shoving with a condensed range, a nice solid condensed range, okay? So these would just go all in. If you do min raise and then somebody re-raises you, anybody really, notice the cutoff here with 20 big blinds has to be super nitty. And why are they so super nitty? Because the 10 big blind open raising range is super strong too. If they do shove, actually they don't shove, they only re-raise small, interestingly enough, because if you make it 2 and then they make it 4, and then somebody else shoves, well, now they can actually get out of the way if you call it off, and they avoid the all-in. So that's cool to see. They don't actually shove. 30 big blind stack never shoves as well. Let's take a look at what small blind gets it in with. A pretty strong range, but wider than I would have estimated. Notice under the gun now just calls off with the pairs and the best hands, and they fold out the garbage, which is what you should do when your range is very polarized to raise with to begin with, right? Okay, let's take a look at another short stack spot where we have 15 big blinds in the small blind, all right? So it's 20 big blinds, they fold, cut off with 30 folds. The button should raise super wide with 60 big blinds, but they fold. From 15 big blinds in the small blind against a much bigger stack in the big blind, we see now a lot of all-ins, right? You're going to find that when you are the short stack, you're usually just going to be applying aggression, especially when you are out of position. You really don't care if your opponent folds, and your shoves are really going to heavily skew towards ace-x and king-x, plus pairs and suited connectors. We do still, though, notice have a non-all-in range. A lot of players in this situation, 15 big blinds deep, play all-in or fold before the flop, 15 big blinds deep, or they limp, or they go all-in. But we clearly see here that you should also have some limps and some min raises, and the limps come from hands that, flop well enough, right? Let's see if our charts work for this. I'm not actually sure they do. Say we do limp. Here's what the big blind should do. Notice a bunch of all ends with the bigger stack here with a lot of these junky offsuit blockers plus some pairs. That's kind of cool. Against an all in, I'm curious. What do we call with? Notice we just call with our best hands, which is why you do want to limp some of your best hands, right? Let's see if we can go back here easily. So yeah, here's what small blind should do. Say small blind instead raises. Notice we're gonna have a lot of calling, but again, still a lot of junky blocker bluffs all in. Say they do face the all in after raising, they're gonna again call off with all their best hands. This one feels a little bit gross to me, calling off with like king 8 suited, but in this scenario, notice we have the shortest stack, right? The stacks are 20, 30, 60, 15, 44. So we are the shallow stack. We can't go around drastically overfolding when we're getting pretty good odds. Let's take a look at one more scenario as the shallow stack. Stacks are 25, 30, 10, 40, 15. So we have fold, fold. Notice the 10 big blind stack now is just mostly open, ripping it in. Although they still do have some small raises. If they do rip it in, small blind with the big stack should call a lot of the time with just the best hands. Big blind also has to call off with the best hands. Let's take a look at this other spot, though. I'm curious what happens when the 25 big blind stack folds and the 30 big blind stack raises. Well, now you'll see the 10 big blind stack is definitely all in or folding. When someone raises in front of you and you are the short stack at a final table, you're going to be heavily inclined to shove, and your shoves are just going to be a very, very good, strong linear range in these situations. All right, so do not think that you should be calling or re-raising small or anything like that in these spots. So look, I know I just threw a lot of information at you. Maybe you want to rewind and watch this part of the video again, but when you are at the final table, play changes dramatically. The big stacks get to play much more loosely and aggressively, and the shallow stacks have to be much more cautious, essentially, whenever their stack is at risk, as do the medium stacks. They really, really, really do not want to go broke. We're not going to discuss heads-up play in this situation. Well, maybe we'll make a fundamentals of heads-up play in the future. We do have a lot of heads-up content at pokercoaching.com by some of the best players in the world, so make sure you check that out. We do have three-handed charts as well in the Preflop app, so I just want to make sure you are aware of these. We're not going to go through these, but a lot of the same principles apply. When you're the big stack, you typically apply a lot of aggression, and when you're the medium stacks, you're really trying to not go broke, and as the shallow stacks, you know, sometimes you realize you got to get it all in, but at the same time, you're also still just trying to not go broke. All right, that is all we're going to talk about pertaining to poker strategy in this video, but I wanted to show you very quickly how much variance you can expect to encounter in tournaments, because it is enlightening and eye-opening to a lot of people because they think they're supposed to win all the time, but you're not going to. To wrap up this overly long video, let's discuss understanding tournament variance. There's a lot of variance in tournaments, and you will experience bigger and bigger swings as your edge is lower, the field size is larger, or as the payouts are more top-heavy. So when will your edge be lower? Well, this is when you're not that good at poker. Maybe you're playing in games where you do not have much of an edge to begin with because everybody's good. Or maybe you're bad at poker and you haven't studied. If you have a small edge, you're going to feel the full brunt of variance. If you're a losing player in the tournament, you're really going to feel the full brunt of variance. Also, some people don't realize that as the field size gets larger, you need a substantially larger bankroll because inevitably you're not going to take first, second, or third nearly as often in a 10,000 person tournament as you will in a 150 person tournament, right? So in the 10,000 person tournament or even a 1,000 person tournament, you're going to end up with a lot more min cashes and a whole lot fewer first, seconds, and thirds, and that's going to mean you're not going to get a big influx of money to your bankroll very often at all. Whereas in a 150 person tournament, you're going to win it 1 in 150 times if you're break even, which, you know, is at least some. Most tournament payouts today usually have roughly the same payout structure, so we're not really going to focus on the more top-heavy tournaments. But if you are playing tournaments that pay, I don't know, 5% of the field or they're winner-take-all or something like that, you'll also experience more variance because inevitably you just don't get a cash that often. Understand that when variance is high, as it is always in tournament poker, you must keep a large bankroll. I cannot make this any more clear. You got to have a big bankroll, like 100 buy-ins or more, if you do not want to go broke. And you can see my full recommendations for bankroll management at pokercoaching.com/bankroll. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at some simulated results And we can sort of extrapolate to see what happens as your edge gets higher or lower, as the field is bigger, et cetera, et cetera. So what are we looking at here? This is from a site called pokerdope.com. They have a variance calculator there. You can go there and play around with it if you'd like. This is a simulation where we are going to play 100 player tournaments with a 30% return on investment. You can see here's our 100 tournaments, right? This is how much money we're going to win. These are $100 tournaments. This presumes we have a 30% return on investment on average. I think that's what we're looking at here. Sure. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so each line we have drawn here, except for this black one in the middle that goes slightly up. This is our average result. Each line here shows what would happen if we played that 100 tournament sample one time. So notice we have this line here that goes straight up pretty much, right? This big green line that goes straight up. This is our best run by a mile. On average, we're going to win $3,000. But this time, we happened to run like God and we won $19,000. Cool. That's what most people think is going to happen. However, look at all these lines down here. Here's the 0 line, roughly right here, right? Notice all of these players played 100 tournaments with a 30% return on investment, and they all lost. There are 20 lines drawn on this chart, by the way. So one person ran ungodly hot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 won more than $3,000. Everybody else lost. 8 or so in this random sample out of 20 lost money. 12 or so lost money in this random sample. And that's because there's a lot of variance in any 100 game sample. A lot of people don't realize that. They think that 100 tournaments is a lot because they play one tournament a weekend. And how could you possibly lose over a year in poker? Well, the answer is there's a ton of variance in poker tournaments. And, you know, maybe you're going to be the one person who runs ungodly hot, but you're probably not. And that's going to result in you losing. Now, if your edge is higher, you are going to see lines that mostly go straight up more often, right? And your average win will be larger. But there's still going to be players who run poorly, right? I mean, notice in this game, this player over 100 tournaments like had a big score. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This person had 8 big scores in 100 tournaments, which is ridiculous. This player here, the biggest loser, had literally none. And this is like, what, $500. They got a $500 cash once or twice. This player's money just went straight into the garbage. And to be fair, I'm surprised somebody didn't run even worse, right? But what I want to make clear is this is someone with a 30% return on investment, which is pretty good, playing 100 games with relatively small fields. Okay? What happens if now we do the same thing, but instead of playing 100 tournaments, we play 1,000? This is going to be if you're playing 3 tournaments every day for a year. Notice now, here's the 0 line. Almost no one loses. Basically, actually, no one loses. No one loses over this 1,000-game sample if you play 100-person tournaments with a small field tournament with a 30% return on investment, which is good. Essentially, you zoom out, you play a lot of games, you add a lot of volume, it makes the variance not really matter so much. That said, 1 in 20 times, this good player played 1,000 tournaments and won about $500. Obviously, there's still going to be some players who run ungodly hot, but, you know, most players are going to fall within this band where they win or lose roughly their return on investment. And as you play more and more games, you zoom farther and farther out, most everyone starts to run closer to the expected return. What about if instead of everything we just said, instead of playing 1,100 player tournaments, we play 1,700 player tournaments? Now, you're not going to get a big win nearly as often. When you do get a big win, it could be gigantic, but you're not going to get a big win nearly as often. Take a look at this player here with their bad run. They started off getting up about $18,000 playing $100 tournaments when they spiked one right off the bat, but then they just bricked it for the rest of the 1,000 games, and they ended up a $22,000 loser, despite having an $18,000 cash at the beginning of their sample. And look, all of these players, they're all going to go on decent downswings. And like this one right here at the end, he actually got a nice spike. Otherwise, he could have been down a lot. Like a lot of these players are not winning a ton of money over 1,000 games. And again, here's the break-even line roughly. It looks like only one player was a loser, but all of these in this vicinity were pretty live to be losers. And that should be telling, right? You ideally don't want to be playing tournaments with a very, very large field, because tournaments with a very, very large field are going to result in you having a ton of variance just naturally. As you run the simulation more and more, you'll see that sometimes the players just run really bad because they just don't get a score. I mean, imagine if this player who had the worst line just didn't get a score right off the bat for 18,000 bucks, 180 buy-ins. He just would have gone straight into the dumpster. His entire bankroll would have gone into the dumpster over 1,000 games. So understand that can happen. All right, let's now compare and contrast this chart with this chart. This first chart we looked at, 100 player tournaments with a 30% ROI. What if the ROI is smaller? In this scenario, if we have a smaller return on investment, you'll see that now a whole lot more players end up losing a large chunk of the time. So notice now the break-even line is barely up, right? Because we only have a 10% return on investment. And now a lot of players lose. A whole lot of players lose. So before, you know, only 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 of them lost. Now, a lot of them are losing. Also notice the big win is 12,000 bucks. Earlier, the big win was 18,000 bucks, right? Just naturally, you're not going to have nearly as many big wins if your edge is much lower. Okay, so as your edge is lower, you're going to be losing a whole lot more often. What about if this 10% return on investment player played 1,000 tournaments? Well, they're going to win. You know, they're going to win about 10,000 bucks on average. But again, look, lots and lots of these players who played this 1,000 game sample lost. And that's because they're playing with a very small edge. When you're playing with a very small edge, you're going to feel a lot of variance. Let's take a look at this spot now. 100 player tournaments with a negative 20% ROI. This is when you think you're good, but you're not. If you do not keep good track of your results, if you think you're better than you actually are, if you do not game select well, if you're just bad at poker. Take a look at this now. Here's the break-even line, right? And you can very clearly see lots of players lose over 100 tournament sample. Now look, a lot of players win over 100 tournament sample too. Maybe 6 or 8 of these players are winning over 100 games, even though they're actually nice losers. To be fair, minus 20% is not horribly bad. It's just kind of bad. If you're horribly bad, that's not going to work out for you. But you see here, anyone can win in tournaments over the short run, which is both good and bad, right? Because if you're a good, strong winning player, you can play a lot and still lose. But if you're a bad player, you can play a lot and still win. There's a lot of variance. What happens, though, when we play 1,000 games? Now, over the long run, here's the break-even line. One player won 5,000 bucks, 50 buy-ins over 1,000 games. 19 other players lost, and some of them lost a ton. This is what happens when you zoom out to the long run for someone who has even a small losing strategy. They're losing at 20% return on investment, which is not even that bad. And if you are actually bad, like minus 50% or something, it's just all going to go straight into the dumpster. You cannot win. And to be fair, even over 100 tournaments, you can't even win. This is why it's vitally important that you have to figure out if you actually have an edge in your game. Because look, at the end of the day, all you have to do to win at poker is find a game you can beat, play it a lot, and keep a proper bankroll. And if you do those 3 things, you will win. But a lot of people, like these people here with minus 20% return on investment, they did not find a game they can beat. And because of that, they're going to lose their shirt. Let's make it even worse for them. Actually, this is probably going to be better for them. Here we have 700 player tournaments. So 1,700 player tournaments with minus 20% ROI. Notice now there's just going to be more variance introduced in general. And sometimes these players are going to spike. Look, now one of these players who's terrible won $40,000, 400 buy-ins, despite being bad. A lot of people can't wrap their head around the idea that someone who's bad at poker can just win a lot of money. And a lot of players who are bad at poker don't realize that they're bad at poker because some of them, notice here, 2 out of 20 actually won a bunch of money. But that's variance for you, right? And to be fair, if you are actually bad at poker, you probably don't mind playing the big field tournaments because that's your only real chance to actually have success. Because if you play 100 player tournaments, you're just going to lose. You're just going to lose. But if you do play large field tournaments, you may actually have a shot. So typically, though, my advice for most poker players who are getting started, who don't have a big bankroll yet, is to play small field tournaments where they expect to have a decently large edge. That's the dream world because you're not going to get rich quick, but your bankroll is going to grow consistently. And if your bankroll grows consistently, that's when you can start taking on more risk. Understand, though, that when your edge is small, you need a much bigger bankroll. A lot of poker players make the blunder of moving up to the point of failure. They just want to play as big as they possibly can. And when they play as big as they possibly can, especially in large field events like 1,000-person tournaments, I mean, you're just gambling. You're just straight up gambling. And, nothing wrong with gambling. Get in there and have fun. But if you think you're not gambling, but you're gambling, that's when disasters happen. Also, you really do not want to play big field tournaments because it's hard to win a big field tournament. And you don't get an increase to your bankroll very often at all. When you do, it's usually a very big increase to your bankroll, but it just doesn't happen that often. So keep those things in mind. I think poker is an excellent way to get rich slowly, but a horrible way to get rich quickly. A lot of people think it's the opposite, though. They're like, oh, I just want to get in there and gamble and win the tournament. But it's hard to win tournaments, and you have to be logical and rational and reasonable and understand what is actually likely to happen, and hopefully going through some of these charts is enlightening. So that's going to be it for this video series. I know it was long, but these are the fundamentals you need to know to get in there and start crushing tournaments. If you enjoyed this video, click the like and subscribe buttons down below. Please do that for me. This was a long video. Took me all day. If you like this video, share it with your friends. I would appreciate it. If you want to learn more, head over to pokercoaching.com. I have a 40-hour-long tournament masterclass there that teaches you everything you need to know to crush your opponents, and also a very, very in-depth advanced tournament course that discusses even more final table and bubble payout scenarios. Also, we have a large section on heads up and a lot of scenarios on various exploits you can make when you know the things your opponents do wrong. So check that out over at pokercoaching.com. Good luck in your games. Have fun. I make these videos because I hope and want for you to succeed. So get in there, learn, improve your skills, and crush the games. Thanks for watching.